Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you all here today, all joining online. My name's Jacinta Perry, and I have the great pleasure of leading the Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership Country Collaborative. We are just getting underway. We've got a few people just logging in from the lobby, but in the interest of staying on time, I will kick things off. I just wanted to take the opportunity to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all of the various lands that we're gathering from today, and all of the different countries that we are joining from. I'm coming to you from Yurrakanji country myself, up in Gimoy, Cairns, and so acknowledging elders past, present and emerging, and I suppose also focusing in on the fact that today's learning conversation is all about social networks and the way we understand our relationships with one another. So I also really wanted to acknowledge the deep traditional knowledge that First Nations people bring to this space, and acknowledge that they've been practicing SNA in many forms via complex kinship systems and law for a very, very, very long time. I'd also like to acknowledge that the work of Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership is only made possible by the generous investment of all of our philanthropic partners. But when it comes to the Country Collaborative specifically, our work would not be possible without the generosity of the Tim Fairfax Family Foundation and the John Villiers Trust. So we have an action-packed lunchtime hour for you today, and you'll hear from a few of the members of our project team. So online joining us, we've got Matt Healy, Principal Consultant and Director from First Person Consulting, Ben Pook, Advocacy and Government Relations Manager from Your Town, Dr. Cara Lilly from the University of Sunshine Coast will be skillfully convening our Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. And we've got Camilla Davidson, Thriving Queensland Kids Partnerships research and evaluation guru, who is also our tech guru for today. So thank you so much for all being here. Also wanted to acknowledge Dan Smith, Project Manager from Communities for Children Capricorn from the Smith family. Unfortunately not online today, but nonetheless an integral part of the social network analysis project so far. So, many of you are very familiar with the work of Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership. So I will do a little bit of an overview today of some of our work and our recently released strategy before we move on to talking about the findings of our social network analysis project in the Country Collaborative and a bit of a sneak peek at our Advocacy Toolkit as well. But just a bit of housekeeping before we do that. We are recording today's webinar. We will send that recording out along with the slides and the Advocacy Toolkit. And that will be to anybody who registered for the webinar. And please do feel free to forward it on to anyone else who you think might be interested. We are going to have a Q&A session at the end. Camilla will be monitoring the chat. Please feel free to post questions as we go, and we'll get to them. We'll get to them in our session at the very end. So, Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership, for those of you who haven't come across us before, is basically just that, a very big partnership and a coalition of the willing, comprised of not-for-profits, philanthropies, researchers, NGOs, peak bodies, you name it, all of whom are working together collectively to create better conditions for all children to thrive. So I'm excited to let you know that last month saw us launch our Phase 3 strategy, 2025 to 2030, and that's really enabling us to progress our work according to 6 different portfolios, which are all around developing and building better childhoods for all kids. So I won't go into all of that. Please do check out our website and please get in touch. If there's something there that piques your interest that you'd like to learn more about, you know, we're absolutely always open to a conversation with anybody who wants to come and partner and collaborate with us. So our work is deeply underpinned by Erases The Nest, which is Australia's child and youth wellbeing framework. The Nest considers child wellbeing across six domains, and actually was formative in the way that we delivered our social network analysis project as well. So more on that when I hand to Matt a little bit later on. The social network analysis project is a piece of work that arose from the Country Collaborative, which is one of the initiatives that I lead. The Country Collaborative really takes a geographical approach to child development and wellbeing and tries to consider what thriving as a child or a young person in a family environment looks like when you live outside of a metropolitan centre. So we have a very broad range of places and communities that's encompassed within that. I always refer to our footprint as not Brisbane. It's quite diverse, and what we recognised when we started to work with this incredibly diverse range of communities is that they're actually very united in a lot of some of the key issues and sore points that kind of come up, but also really united in a lot of the common assets that they have to draw on. And one of those things that was identified as a bit of a sore point was around access to decision makers who are from metropolitan centres, and how we can strengthen that collectively. Something that was really recognised as an asset amongst the Country Collaborative was that people in rural, regional, remote communities tend to do partnerships well. We see like a high level of service integration and social capital and human connection that functions within those communities. And that's a pretty amazing kind of environment to get to draw on to be able to advance and progress our work. So we were interested in understanding that on a deeper level, and we were interested in different ways that we could tell that story about the centrality and the function of partnerships when it comes to child wellbeing across rural, regional, remote communities. And from there, the Social Network Analysis Project was born. So the SNAP, as we fondly refer to it, has basically involved us mapping an organisational network across country Queensland to be able to better understand where those connections and leverage points exist. Why? Because we think that by aligning our work collectively, we can do more together. We can go further together. And so the SNAP has really been about trying to uncover those insights to inform the next steps for the Country Collaborative. So as we started to formulate the project, we realised, this isn't really just useful for us. This is probably useful for a whole range of people across communities. So it was our intent that we not only do the SNA for our own purposes, but that we're also able to share a little bit about our findings and our approach to help inform folks like yourselves who might be considering what undertaking an SNA in your own organisation or communities might entail. So instead of just doing the SNA, we also decided to enter into a learning partnership with the wonderful Matt Healy from First Person Consulting. And so in addition to the SNA, we have delivered 2 webinars now, this being number 2. And we're also on the cusp of releasing an advocacy toolkit that not only brings together some really practical information about how to get started on conducting an SNA, but then some next steps in terms of how you can use those insights to inform a really impactful advocacy approach. So, so that you can all hear a little bit more about SNA and how it all works and what we found in the Country Collaborative, I would now like to hand over to Matt Healy, Principal Consultant from First Person Consulting, who will be able to take us through what we uncovered. Thanks, Matt.
Great. Thanks, Jacinta. So just to sort of recap for people quickly, as Jacinta mentioned, we had our first webinar where we did kind of do a bit more of a deep dive into the practicalities of what network analysis is and what it means. But just as a bit of a refresher and to help remind people what it actually is and to help understand what the results look like. SNA, when we talk about it, is really a mapping technique, and it's specifically a mapping technique that uses graph theory as its sort of methodological basis. So it's about modeling relationships, and you can model relationships between anything. I would kind of define it across like actors or organizations or like factors like determinants. It's really all about identifying lines and dots. And so you have to do a lot of like definitional work to define what you mean by what is the dot and what is the line, what are the things that justify a connection. But it's really something that's useful because not only is it giving you a visual, it's also something you can analyze. So even at the most basic level, by identifying the different parts of your network, so the different organizations or the different groups that are involved and who's connected to who, even at that most basic level with no other information, you can analyze the resulting relationships and, you know, draw out some interesting ideas to basically tell you who is influential. Now, what we mean by influence varies, but the broad premise is that you can identify who is most central. When we talk about like centrality, those sort of measures are different. They're calculated differently. So you not only get like one answer, you can actually get lots of different answers depending on what it is that you're trying to understand. And this is why when you're thinking about, in this context, like say advocacy, understanding who is most central in a network can be really important. You can also think of it in terms of the opposite, which is who is on the periphery or who is kind of on the edge of a network, who is not included as well. So it's not like a single use process or single use result. It's really something that's kind of best used in like a dynamic sense. So like something you're constantly referencing or asking questions of. The thing that is really important is that the results are just a number. So you will get this result that means kind of, you know, something interesting, but also it's out of context. So your task when you get these results, and I'll do this for you in a second, is to actually add a bit of context to it by saying, well, within the context of the network that we've mapped, this is what this result means. This is how we can use this information. So think of it like a bit of a muscle, like you have to kind of practice it and use it. And again, that's what's kind of emerged for us through this project, is that this isn't something that we're suggesting is like, do this once and then never do it again. It's kind of something that you can almost think of like an attitude or like a mindset that you can think about when you're approaching your work, like thinking about the networks and the relationships that exist, not just between your organization or yourself and other organizations, but who they're connected to and what your broader sort of ecosystem of relationships looks like. I mentioned this already, but as I said, you can apply this to any form of network, and I would loosely describe that as like actor networks, so like organizations, groups, people, or you could think of it like determinants of health style. So like what are the things that influence each other, that influence health? So SNA can apply to any of these. It's a tool that's really beneficial about looking at networks, whatever they look like or however they're defined. So there are many different ways of understanding what influence looks like or what centrality looks like. There are many, but these are the four most common, and I've highlighted just two that I'm going to focus on today. Not to like read these out to you, but in really quick terms, you've basically got a metric that relates to the number of connections that organizations have. So that's degree, which can be broken down into directions like inward coming connections and outward going connections. Closeness centrality is like how close someone is to everyone else in the network. Betweenness centrality is how often someone sits between two other connections. So like bridging, like who bridges otherwise isolated groups in the network. And eigenvector centrality is essentially like if I only had one friend, but that friend was Taylor Swift, that would make me influential. So it's basically trying to highlight that not all connections are weighted equally, that sometimes one connection can be really powerful if that connection is to someone who is really influential. So those are the broad brushstrokes, but the two that I've highlighted here, degree and betweenness, are the ones that I want to speak to in a second when I comment on some of the results. So when we got into designing the SNA for Not Brisbane, as Jacinta so artfully described it, there's kind of three broad steps that I would typically apply to any SNA, and I'll just present these briefly for you. Is that we have to really get clear on what the question is that we want to answer. So for us, it was, what do the networks look like outside of Brisbane, or that are, connected to parts of Brisbane but are focused on regional areas? What do they look like? So who's connected to who? And most importantly, like in relation to what? Like what does that partnership or that collaboration look like? Are they sharing information? Are they working on shared service delivery? The second element of that is then how good is that relationship? And we kind of defined that in terms of like maturity, like how advanced is the relationship in terms of its development, and how sort of big of a contribution does that relationship make to the organization's objectives. We then did all the researchy stuff, which I'm not going to read out. So we got some ethics clearance, we developed the survey, we distributed the survey. Survey went out through LinkedIn and email and things like that. I then spent about a week cleaning it, and it was a nightmare. And then we did the fun stuff, which is create the maps, which is why we're here. I didn't have sound effects, but just picture a drum roll. This is what it looks like. So this is the network map that we produced. We had 86 people respond on behalf of their organization, and this is what 553 different organizations or sites of like bigger organizations looks like. You can see the counts of like the different types of organizations that are in here, and these span just about every part of Queensland that you can probably think of. There's a whole bunch of numbers there and things like that. And again, if you want to just think about really big messages, this is only a fraction of what would actually exist, because as you can see, there's only 86 people that have responded. We've still identified a lot of relationships. If I wanted to make this even bigger, I would then go to organizations identified that didn't respond and get their relationships, and this will continue on forever, which is not feasible, but it gives you a bit of a sense of how big these things can get. So at an outset, we have a pretty good sense of who's connected to who in relation to the nest areas of work in Queensland, which is really, really interesting. Just for context, that little black dot there is Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership. And I'm pointing that out just to give you a sense of where they sit in this network. Like they're not in the center, which is where our bias would kind of draw our eye to. But also this is to help anchor you to understand some of the next sets of results. If we want to think about like influence in terms of who's most popular, so who do people look to the most, in degree, which is incoming connections, tells us some really interesting things. In particular, like who people look to as like a leader in the network. And you can see that, yes, Thriving Queensland Kids is there, but there are also lots of other dots that are kind of highlighted with that yellowy color spread throughout as well. I'm not going to go into like the weighting and how that is all calculated, but basically it means that like these are really advanced relationships held by people that are then really central. So like leaders is maybe my simple way of describing it. But if you look at it in more granular detail, you can actually see that these people are also kind of talking to each other. And it might not surprise you, given the context that we're in, that many of these are actually a part of the Country Collaborative as well. So that's why they're kind of connected to each other. There's Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership, just to anchor it. But you can also see that there's a couple of dots that are actually not connected to anyone else here in the bottom right corner. If I wanted to use this information, I would then probably ask myself, well, who are those people? And who are they connected to? And do I want to be connected with them? Like, do we have shared priorities? Already some interesting questions. If we want to then think about like betweenness, which like is bridging, like who is bridging other people? Who is bridging isolated networks? Again, we can kind of see some groups emerging here, which I will then bring out. But interestingly, they're actually not just bridging isolated groups. They're also like kind of formed their own little mini network here. And again, there's Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership, who is kind of on the edge. Your town is in there somewhere, Ben. But interestingly, the one that stands out for me the most is that one off to the left-hand side, who's kind of off by themselves relative to everyone else. That tells me that that particular organization is playing a really important role in terms of bridging groups, but also they are not connected in with Thriving Queensland Kids or your town. So I would immediately look at this and say, who is that? And again, do I want to be connected with them? Can we work together on something? This is to give you a bit of a sense, if you look at the two different types of groups in terms of those rankings of those scores, that it's not the same organizations necessarily. Now, Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership is in both, and this makes sense because this is kind of coming from them. But most of the organizations are not represented in both networks. And that kind of means that who is influential varies, and it varies depending on the different ways in which these results are calculated. But ultimately, what it means is that the things that we might want to use this information for aren't going to mean that we're always going to Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership to try and work with them. But we maybe need to tailor who we work with based on the different sets of requirements that we have for the sorts of aims that we have. Now, I'm going to leave you with some possible uses. Hopefully this has maybe piqued your interest a little bit. Number one, this is a great technique for testing assumptions. When you want to understand who is most central or who you think is most influential in a network, visibility and who you think is most influential is often not the same as actual actors that are influential. So just because someone's got a big brand doesn't mean that they are actually the group that everyone is working with or wants to, or is looking to work with. So it's a great way to test our assumptions around that. As we're getting into planning your advocacy and engagement strategies, figuring out who you want to go to maybe build a bit of a coalition of the willing around shared purposes. Again, this is a great way to do it, and I've tried to signpost a couple of ideas there as well. These results are all quantitative, so you could look at this longitudinally. So we could do this process annually, for instance, and see how people's relationships and networks are shifting over time due to different reasons as well. And ultimately, again, like what we'll see in a little bit, the maps that I've shown you, while static here, it's actually interactive. And so you could feed that back into other processes as well to generate discussions and do a bit of shared sense making. That's basically it for me in terms of the results, which was super quick. But as I've flagged, we basically have some interesting points to talk through around advocacy, which I think Jacinta is going to speak to next.
Thank you so much for that, Matt. So as the results have absolutely shown, it's what we all kind of know to be true, which is that it's not what you know, it's who you know. And, that's really at the crux of social network analysis. There are many big brands out there. There are many people out there who spend a huge amount of time on crafting the perfect messaging and the perfect campaign. But what SNA really helps us to do is to target that messaging much more effectively, but also to help us to understand how we can go about implementing our work, forming coalitions, and actually reaching the scale that we'd hopefully like to achieve. So it really takes sort of traditional approaches and absolutely, turns up the volume on them and enables us to do so with even more accuracy. So it's a very interesting and powerful way of kind of being able to do it. So in addition to the webinars, as I mentioned, we wanted to be able to sort of showcase some of our learnings via a social network analysis and systemic advocacy toolkit. So this is going to be released in the coming weeks, but we did want to talk you through it today so that you are sure to open it when it comes through your inbox. But really what we're aiming to provide you with is a how-to guide that's really going to take you through step by step what Matt has just detailed very well. But then some considerations about, okay, so we've got our SNA, how do we then apply it, particularly in the context of systemic advocacy? We do have the findings in there of the SNAP in the country collaborative to help sort of frame it and guide your thinking as well. And then some really step-by-step meaty guides and resources about, okay, so then how do we actually use this to inform creation of an advocacy campaign? So once that is out and released, it will come through with the webinar recording as well. And I'd invite you to, like I said, please send it on far and wide to your networks when it does. But it's now my pleasure to hand over to Ben Pook, the Advocacy and Government Relations Manager at Your Town, who is going to share some of the practicalities of how we can actually use SNA to inform advocacy. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thanks so much, Jacinta. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. Also want to thank a couple of my colleagues who are here on the call as well from Kids Helpline, which is great to see. So my name's Ben Pook. I'm the Advocacy and Government Relations Manager for your town. So I've been in this role now for about 3 years, but have worked kind of across the sector in terms of government relations advocacy, but also in the community space as well with young people. So I think I'm lucky in that I get to combine both sets of skills and actually create change for the young people and families that I've worked with in the past. So to give you a little bit of an overview of your town, some people have probably, or most people may have heard of your town, but not really understand that context that we work in. So at your town, we're really focused on improving the lives of children and young people. And in our work in the advocacy and government relations team, as Jacinta kind of mentioned, we're really focused on systemic advocacy. So what we're trying to do there is influence systems as a whole to create change through either policies, funding, or government strategies. This isn't really a short-term piece of advocacy. It's not something generally you do once and then that's it. You don't have to do it again. It really can take a long time because what we're trying to do is really change people's minds on key issues rather than just on one little decision. I'll be honest, sometimes you can get lucky, and we've gotten lucky, and sometimes change can just happen like that. But other times, as I said, this can take years. I know some of the work we've done with Western Australia, say, for example, we started that 4 years ago, and we're just finally getting an outcome now. But what I want to do today is give you a bit of a snapshot of the S&A process from an advocacy perspective. So the SNAP, what we're calling it in terms of the process that we're following as well. And how I'll be talking about it in a little bit of the context of the work that we do. So you can see up on the screen just some of the organisational priorities that we have, the programs that we run, and also who we talk to. So it just gives you a bit of context for what I'm saying in the next section. So this is the process that we've got outlined in the toolkit. So our advocacy process, we've used the SNAP acronym to try and make sure people don't have to remember too many complex acronyms, and have gone with this strategy, network, action, and post-action approach. Now, I'll also talk as we work through this diagram around how S&A can really assist. And I'll be honest, before I started this project, I was using S&A, but didn't know I was using S&A. And Matt's education and support has really helped me realize, this is what we've been doing. Now I can actually take it deeper. So I think many of you, if you're thinking about an advocacy project or have been working in this space, will have actually been using some of these techniques. You may just not have the words and the actions that Matt was talking about or that are available in the toolkit. So this strategy, looking at it, is something that we've been using in my team to create change. And it's really important that you have a really structured approach, that you're creating a strategy, you're building a network to actually achieve that sustainable change. And look, we have used this in a number of different projects. We've helped to increase funding for Kids Helpline. We've been able to get funding for projects which were pilots and now have permanent. We've also been able to make changes to legislation and decisions from government at state and federal levels. So it's not just something we've developed, it is something that definitely works and works really well with S&A. My one tip for you all, and if you take nothing away from today around advocacy apart from this, is you will have to work through this process a number of times to create change. And just like the SNAP process in terms of the S&A, you have to do it again and again as things change and mature. You've got to do the same with advocacy. It's never just kind of a one shot, one set of meetings and you're done. It is a continual process that you need to work through. So first thing you need to do if you're going to complete an advocacy process is definitely have a strategy. You really need to know what you're trying to change, who you're going to involve, type of messages you'll deliver, and the outcomes you're really trying to achieve. Now, from an S&A perspective, this is the time to actually start mapping your network. This is the time for you to start looking at, well, who are the Jacintas and Matts in my world that I can, help me to get contact with important people or people who can provide funding, or just who else is passionate about this and help me along the way. Like who's my carer who has all this background information and knowledge that I can draw on. Maybe they're not going to be able to get me a meeting with the decision maker, but they're actually going to make that message more powerful. So think about, in terms of your key issues, who's impacted or involved, what's your long-term goal or your long-term vision in this issue or in this area. Who are your key messages? Messages are really important. You don't just want to come across with a bit of an idea. You really want to try and be specific and look at, well, why should people listen? Why should they be interested? And what potentially could happen if they don't? So up there on the screen, I've actually got a message, one of our key messages when we were talking to the federal government around the social network ban. And we were really concerned from a Kids Helpline perspective about young people from marginalised backgrounds and how they were keeping connection with their communities that they'd created online. And so this was actually a really key point in us helping to change the minds of the federal government around exactly what was going to be in and out of the social media ban. Now, from all of this, it's really key you've also got an action plan for your strategy. What are you going to do and when? Now, you might not keep to it exactly, but it really helps you identify, well, what are your key tasks? What are your key actions that you're going to take forward through the whole process? Now, your network is completely key. You can't achieve change by yourself. You really need to make sure that you've got that network around you, and the S&A, as we've spoken about already, is really helpful. In Matt's example, I'm not going to talk any more about that because it's a fantastic explanation he provided, but it creates those connections for you to create change. And look, your allies are essential. So that helps you not just to create that depth, but also the energy to create a sustainable campaign. Look, I think a tip here is individuals or really topical issues can create a headline. You can get that article in the paper, but that network will actually really make sure that you've got that change occurring and those connections in the community with philanthropic bodies, with government, with ministers, that means that you create that immediate and long-term impact that I really believe that most of us in this network are looking for. As Matt did say, though, that will change what your network looks like through your S&A. So you need to make sure that you're updating it to see, well, where are my stronger connections? Where are the people that can actually connect me to those change makers? A tip here is I really just wouldn't focus on those people who are in positions of power. I wouldn't just focus on your directors of philanthropics or your ministers. It's people who can actually influence the decision makers who are often the most important, who get you the meetings or tell you about opportunities that are coming up. And to be honest, they're usually the ones then that end up in positions of influence and power down the track. And I'll talk in a minute about the importance of thinking long term. And those people are actually the ones who will generally end up in positions that can create the change for you when you're advocating for it. If you look at that little diagram I've got in the background, the most obvious connection might be along the top, one connection into, say, that red dot, which is the decision maker. But it might actually be easier to go through the two dots at the bottom to actually reach that really key connection, because those people actually have the better relationship, the better knowledge, and the better connection to where decisions are made. Okay. Now I'm just going to plug my Taylor Swift moment there with the photo. To say there's our Taylor Swift for some decisions that we helped to get made. But the next stage is the action part. Now, most people might think about this This is where most people will go in an advocacy project, but you've got to come back. You've got to think about that strategy. You've got to think about your network before you hop into this part. What you will find, though, is you very quickly with this process could find yourself jumping between post-action, networking, back to action. You know, this week, I've gone from 3 days talking to an advisor in an MP's office to now tomorrow having a meeting with the minister's office because of what that advisor has done. Again, that's where those really influential people who are in junior positions can come in, and how quickly change can happen when an opportunity arises. And look, action can look very different from what you're working on, what issues you're looking at, or who you're trying to influence. So as I talk about here in just the summary, it can be through things like submissions, events, surveys, but there's a couple of really basic things that I think a lot of people overlook and get wrong. And that's you're writing letters, requesting meetings, and preparing briefings. It's really how you get in front of decision makers, and there's a bit of a process and a procedure you need to follow, and that's outlined in the toolkit for you. I'd really recommend have a look at the structure that's provided there and some of the tips, because it will just help things to go a little bit smoother, and just make sure that you're not getting disheartened because you're not getting the response that you want. I will say you're going to get it wrong. You're going to get this part wrong, and that's not a bad thing. It's a learning curve. It's a learning process. You know, philanthropics, governments won't expect you to be perfect every time. In fact, it can make for some good commentary and good jokes down the line. So don't be too worried if you make a bit of a mistake or get something a little bit wrong. Also think about action. It's not just sometimes those big things like the reports and meetings. It can just be as simple as putting in your plan, when are the local shows? When maybe potentially is a minister going to be in town or holding a stall at a market? Use those opportunities just to keep reminding them that you're there and that you're talking about this issue, and this issue is important. The other thing with action is think about then how your network can be involved. Who in your network can actually help you, could be part of that meeting. You know, we do submissions with Headspace regularly because we're both talking in the mental health space for young people and children. So it's really important to present that collective and unified voice. Now, this one seems like a really simple thing, but it's the one often that people get wrong and people forget about. And I'll be honest, sometimes when we're really busy, it's something that slips our mind as well. But once you've had a connection or a meeting, you want to make sure that you're actually following up. You're having your post-action actions, and you're doing what you said you were going to do. So whether that's providing updates or a record of what you've done previously to who you've met with or who you've had an activity with, whether it is just making a record for yourself, noting down where that relationship has been strengthened or who potentially you need to connect to. You know, this is really essential, because if you can maintain your relationships effectively, they're going to do the work for you in the advocacy space, or they may actually become a really strong ally for you in the future. And as I said earlier, they could have potentially be in a position of power where they can provide funding or provide support for what you're advocating for. Now, it's okay, people will drop in and out. You will lose relationships as people move positions. But what you will see is that if they're strong and there's good connections, when they get into a new position or have a new opportunity, you'll be the first person that they call. Or when you run into them at something, they'll go, right, let's work together on this, or let's come together and see what we can do. So really think long-term where you can. And to me, this is another opportunity just to keep updating your SNA, thinking about those connections, the closeness and betweenness, to really then identify what your best avenues are to create change and your best people to maintain relationships would be. And so to me, Bit of a summary here before I hand over back to Matt is, look, relationships are everything. The SNA is a really powerful tool in terms of identifying what relationships you've got, what relationships you should be looking at, and where your potential for opportunities to advocate for are. And just keep following the cycle. If it's something that's worthwhile advocating for and you've got the support, keep going, keep pushing forward. You know, there'll be little steps that you make along the way, which will actually be really powerful in the future, because what you need to be doing is really looking, well, when's the next election cycle coming? When's the next government strategy? When's the next organisational or investment strategy coming? And sometimes those opportunities when reviews are announced can just pop into your lap. And if you've done all the hard work and have been building that network and your messaging, you can then take advantage of those when they're announced, rather than trying to just build it from nothing. So I think I've just kept to time, Jacinta. I'll hand back to Matt to take us through a bit of an example of the SNA now.
Great, thanks, Ben. So this is just to try and demonstrate a little bit about what I was saying about the dynamic nature of how you can make the most of this sort of process. So the images that I shared earlier are static, which means that, you know, they are kind of locked in place. And I've done some of that interpretation for you, but you know, inevitably there will be more questions, or there might be, you know, new circumstances that arise. The great thing with network analysis is that when you've got the data set, you can kind of re-ask it different questions, or, you know, sort of model different situations. So this is just like a mock scenario that I've put together. So this is our network that I shared earlier. So there's 553 organizations, 700 and something relationships. For context, there's Thriving Queensland Kids. And you can see there that it's kind of highlighted their little network of organizations that they'd identified. So there's a lot of organizations here, and a lot of relationships, a lot of stuff going on. So let's say hypothetically, we've got this organization here, this triangle, which is a small community organization. It's got a couple of relationships. You can see there if I hover over it, it's got two little blue triangles. So it's got two other partners that it kind of works with. And that's, you know, that's kind of it. So it doesn't have a huge network. So it's probably, you know, mainly volunteers or like quite small, whatever it might be. Down over here in this corner, we've got a government department that's been, you know, identified. And let's say hypothetically, this organization, to Ben's point, has identified that this government department would be a prime group for them to reach with some form of advocacy effort. But, you know, there's a lot of steps in between. There's no direct line of sight between this organization and this one. Because we have this network map, we can actually draw out a bit of a pathway. So this is an organization, one of the two organizations that this hypothetical group, well, they're not hypothetical, they're real, but in this scenario, it's hypothetical. They are able to approach one of their two partners, and we can actually start to build out a bit of a daisy chain between them, where effectively this organization might say to their key partner, hey, I need to reach this group down here. Do you know anyone? And this group might say, well, actually, I know this organization here. I think that they are working with them or are close to working with them. And what we can start to build out is a bit of a like chain of relationships, where effectively, if we want a message from this organization here to reach down here, we can see that there's actually a direct pathway between now what is effectively two new organizations for this group to work with in order to reach this group. It's obviously a very cavalier example. There's lots of work that you would have to do in this particular circumstance. However, what it highlights is that it's not unrealistic for this organization to be able to communicate with this organization down here, provided that you know, they start to invest in and build some relationships with others along that way. So to Ben's point about like keep pushing forward, it's not a impossible task for this organization to kind of get in front of this government department down here, but there are some steps along the way and some relationships that would have to be built. Now, obviously, this, you know, in context, this is kind of like transcending half of the map. Obviously, if Thriving Queensland Kids, who is up here, wanted to reach one of the government organisations down over here, there is many, many steps in between. So what this is also highlighting is, from a strategy perspective, thinking about, well, who do we need to reach, but also realistically, who can we reach and what would be required to get there. This is like the real data that was captured through our SNA process. And the sort of scenario I've highlighted here is a mock one. But it does mean that, you know, there are ways in which you can build up understandings of who works with who could we partner with in order to then leverage their network to then reach other organizations or other partners to further, I guess, strengthen that coalition. So these are all real networks that have been provided through this process. And, you know, this is a single point in time. Inevitably, there will be more organizations that could be added. But also this was, you know, a lot of work to set up, but we've done it once, and now it would be a lot less effort to maintain this than it would be to do it again for the first time. So, you know, this has been a great exercise from my perspective in terms of understanding what is realistic for an organization like Thriving Queensland Kids and its position as an intermediary in Queensland. But also one thing to highlight, and I think this is kind of interesting as like an assumption tester, is our bias might be to assume that Thriving Queensland Kids, as the instigator of this project through the Country Collaborative, would be in the center of our map. But actually, they're kind of like up here on the edge. And if you look at who their direct connections are that I've highlighted here, there are many, many others that are not directly connected with them or that did not identify them as a direct connection. So it also highlights that even though TQKP is very central in many ways, there are actually many other networks that exist that TQKP is not a direct part of. And so I think just highlights like how much work is going on in Queensland and how many relationships and networks and things there are as well. So I'm going to leave it there because we are at time, but there are spaces for questions in the chat function, and I think Cara is going to coordinate that part. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everyone.
Okay, thank you, Matt, and thanks everyone. So they're a bit of a quiet bunch, so there's not a lot of questions at this point in time, but perhaps people have been eating and trying to digest all of that information that both Matt and Ben have presented today. And we're very conscious that that is a very speedy kind of snapshot of what the project has been all about. So I do invite you to put some questions into the chat. But while you're doing that, I'm happy to throw a couple of questions out as well. So I have probably a few, and maybe to Ben first, and then Matt, I wouldn't mind sort of adding to that. But Ben, I know we've sort of talked a lot through this webinar around using SNA to do advocacy and the importance of finding your allies and finding then who can take that message forward, so the influencers or the decision makers. I wonder if you can sort of talk a little bit to why that's effective for advocacy, and I guess all of the people here, what might that look like as a coalition for country in advocating for families and children?
A long question.
It was about 3 questions in the end.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of reasons that I'll go into in terms of why those connections are so important. The first one is it seems really simple, but it gets a little complicated, but it's the weight of the message. If you've got one person saying something, it's not very loud, but if you have a crowd, it will just gather noise and it will be quite constant. And the way I think about this is that anywhere a decision maker ends up going, they will potentially end up hearing about the issue. So if they're talking to someone on the street, if they're hopping on their social media feed, if they're in a meeting with other community organisations or a network, they're talking to advisors in the department or in their office, they just get this same message, or they're always talking about, hey, this is what the Smith family is doing. This is what, the Gayndah Community Centre is working on at the moment, or Eidsvoll Community Centre. You need to, go and talk to them and look at what they're doing. So it's that weight of the noise. The connection's also really important because you don't always, as an individual or as an individual organisation, have the whole story. You can have, even like with Kids Helpline, we've got over 30 years of data, but we don't have the whole story about children and young people's mental health. So that can actually be added to by talking to organisations, in my example earlier about Headspace, or talking to, university researchers to say, right, what else can we add to this? So that's where I would say those connections are really, really important. From a country perspective, and really thinking about smaller communities, is it then suddenly becomes important if we're hearing very similar or the same issues. And I'll go just into a straight government perspective here rather than philanthropics. But if you've got one MP, so whether it's a state or a federal MP talking about an issue, it's not a loud voice. But if suddenly you've got 3 or 4 communities across, 2 or 3 electorates or 4 or 5 electorates who are talking about this as an issue, you actually then end up in a situation where you've got 4 or 5 MPs, maybe 7 or 8 across, state and territory in Queensland, state and federal in Queensland, that are suddenly talking about the issue. And there's a lot of networks that when you're working in this space, you understand are behind the scenes. And those people at state and federal levels can be talking to each other. So that's why I think it's really, really important from a real focus on country. What it might look like is it could look exactly like what this network is, what Jacinta's helped set up. Collective action is a term, if anyone's interested to go and have a look at it, that is really, really powerful in terms of creating change. I think that's the approach that country would be best looking at. To really make movement forward in terms of, whether it is health, mental health, education, etc. I think I covered everything.
Thanks, Ben, for that. Yes. And there are a couple of other questions then, and just on time, I see, Matt, you've responded to one of them. If we go back to, there's a couple of questions around what kinds of survey questions we included to be able to map the connections.
Yeah. And I can actually weave together answers to all 3 of those questions that are there simultaneously.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So basically, an SNA survey is like, technically it's a standard survey, but it's actually not a standard survey, because what you're asking is questions of each relationship that someone has. So the way I describe it is like compounded questioning. So if someone gives you 10 relationships and you want to ask 2 questions per relationship, you're asking them 20 questions. So you have to be very targeted in what you want to understand about someone's set of relationships. My default position with partnerships or networks of this sort is that you can't really get to fewer than 2 questions per relationship if you want to understand how good it is, or like what its quality is. And that's because you need to ask questions about its purpose. So like how aligned you are, or like how good the relationship is in terms of its like contribution to your objectives, or like why does that relationship exist. But then the other question is like, how well does it work? And that's because in all of these that I've done, I've never been able to construct such a perfectly worded question that isn't double-barreled, that gets to the heart of it, which is, yes, we are on the same page about why we work together, and we work together well. Because you can have a relationship that does not work well, but is really important strategically, and vice versa. You can have relationships that don't have really that much of a strategic importance at that moment in time, but you get along great. Like you can have both. And so like those to me are really the most important questions to ask. Everything else, optional, in my view. But primarily when you're doing SNA surveys, it's always discrete information, and that's the key. It's categorized or numerical. Free text doesn't really get analyzed in SNA. It provides context, and that's kind of just the nature of the methodology. Michelle and Catherine's questions relate to like sampling and things like that. You don't have to survey people at all. all you're really capturing are perspectives on networks. So your organization has a network, like TQKPs and UniSC has a network, and that could be it, and that's all you look at. But what you will not have is who your network has as their network. So what I would describe it as is like slices of reality. You will never get the objective truth, to Catherine's point around like the sample, but you will get a version of it. And then it's purely the same as any other research method, which is you contextualize your results. It's not every relationship that these organizations have. It is relationships specifically related to work aligned to the nest. Like that is the crux of it. And I wouldn't hang my hat on this as like the be all and end all. This is a point in time that I would be suggesting gets added to over time as well. And that's kind of a key point. I think I got 2 questions in one there.
I think you did a few.
And I've answered one in writing.
Yes,
Cheekily.
I saw that. So that's good.
And I'd hop in there as well and agree with you, Matt, from Michelle's question is you can just use it really, really effectively to map who you know and where you want to go as a really first point in your strategy around an advocacy project. And I think, I don't know if I mentioned this, but we did that. We do that with all of our kind of advocacy approaches. You know, we look at who's going to be influential and who do we already have those connections with.
Yeah, a large part of this, like SNA as a technique, is really like a very systematic approach to what a lot of people who work in like strategy or partnership-based roles do anyway, which is like, who do people work with and who do we need to work with in order to get somewhere else? It's just that SNA is kind of adding a particular methodological dimension to it, and kind of allows you to do some funky maths in terms of like looking at the network and things like that too. Sorry, Cara, Ben and I are just like going off script now.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's perfectly fine. And I see Jacinta's probably going to jump in as well because she's the timekeeper and we've got 2 minutes left. So thank you everybody for your questions.
Yeah,
Thanks,
no, thank you both for your insights and Cara for convening. I guess I also wanted to flag that from my perspective, something that's always come up, you know, in across my career in partnerships is that we all know how central partnerships are. Everything's about partnerships and relationships, but being able to really quantify what that kind of intangible social capital actually looks like is a completely different kettle of fish. So it's kind of a different way of telling an important story. And as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to being able to influence people effectively, having a few different angles and approaches to be able to do that is really, really valuable. You know, particularly when we're looking at something complex like partnerships, networks, and, you know, how it informs advocacy approaches as well. So I really thank everybody for coming along today to learn a little bit more about it. I do hope that you get a huge amount out of the Advocacy Toolkit, which will be released in a very, very short minute. So please look out for a copy of it in your inbox. And just a reminder to please get in contact with Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership, with First Person Consulting, your town or University of Sunshine Coast. Any of our project team are very happy to have a more deep conversation with you about SNA and its application. We are at time now, so I will leave it there, but just like to thank you all warmly again for your time today, and thank all presenters as well for sharing your insights. I do appreciate it. Take care, everyone.